Well, hello y'all. Welcome to another episode of Historical Markers. Today we are in Hickman County, Kentucky. We thought we'd get out and explore and see what we can find. So join us as we look at some of the history of Hickman County, Kentucky. In 1861, the Mississippi River provided a potential avenue of invasion for the Union Army into the seceded southern states. In September, to preempt such a move, Confederate General Leonidas Polk occupied and fortified the river bluffs at Columbus and closely monitored river traffic. Kentucky's official neutrality ended with the move. On November 6, 1861, Union General U.S. Grant moved on Columbus from Cairo, Illinois, using steamboats. As Polk's defenses at Columbus were strong, Grant attacked Camp Johnston, a Confederate outpost at Belmont, Missouri, on November 7th. Union troops initially routed the Confederates, but after Southern reinforcements crossed the Mississippi River from Columbus, the Federals returned to Cairo. Crossing over. One of the busiest trading towns along the Mississippi River in the 1830s, Columbus, Kentucky, boasted a post office, sawmill, tavern, and 4 trading stores. Columbus became a part of Indian removal on the Trail of Tears when nearly 1,100 Cherokee, led by John Bingham, arrived in 1838. They camped on a bluff overlooking the river and the town of Columbus, originally located on the riverbank. The bluff is now part of the Columbus-Belmont State Park. It's just atrocious. They passed this way, home to thousands of men, women, and children. The Cherokee Nation once spread across parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. The 1830 Indian Removal Act required the Cherokee surrender their land and move west. And it talks about the Trail of Tears and how it went over and how many died. And it talks about that they did include traveling on this stretch of the Mississippi River. During that time, they would haul them on these barges behind the ferry boats. And yeah, it was really a horrible time in our country's history. Just deplorable. See all of the different tribes that were relocated to what was considered at the time territory that was not worth anything. This marker is for Marion Rust, 1879 and 1958. Red Cross agent Marion Rust came to Columbus after its destruction in 1927 by Mississippi floods. Noting riverbank cave-ins, Rust directed relocation of the town. Exploring the area, he found remains of Confederate garrison and envisioned Civil War Memorial Park. With CCC camp labor, he partially restored the fort area in 1934 to 37, providing a major step in the development of the present state park. This marker here is talking about the history of Columbus, Kentucky. It's pretty interesting. The settlement that was originally made was on the banks, of course, of the Mississippi, and it was actually proposed as the location for the nation's capital after the War of 1812. But it was in the floodplain. You can see the survey, everything, and talking about the railroads coming through in the history. I'm just going to kind of scroll down through here. Please feel free to pause if you can and read the different items. Just talking about the Jackson Purchase, the history of slavery in Columbus. Again, talking about that it was on the floodplain. And it was local. Now, when I talked about it's local tradition that plays places Columbus as a consideration for the nation's capital, but I think it's kind of cool. I'm going to throw it in there. And then it talks about the railroads, all the different railroads that came through. Columbus after the Civil War. And then Old Columbus talks about it being destroyed. The flood of 1827 broke the levee, and the Red Cross got them established on the nearby bluff, and a lot of the houses and the old buildings. I don't know if you can see in these pictures; it's kind of hard to tell. They're being moved. If the owner couldn't provide for the cost of moving, the Red Cross paid for it. And by April of 1828, 600 people occupied the new town of Columbus. It talks about the development of the state park here and how that went. The CCC was involved in establishing all of the facilities and everything here at the state park. So quite a colorful history for Columbus, Kentucky. A river view of history. The Mississippi River looms large in our history. Early on, it marked the nation's westernmost boundary. As the country expanded, the river became the eastern border of the western frontier. The mighty Mississippi linked far-flung places in trade and traffic and sustained the small towns and large cities that lined its banks. Control of the Mississippi River was considered key to winning the Civil War. Union and Confederate strategies each made the river a major focus of its western campaign. Mark Twain wrote, "When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to be a steamboatman on the great Mississippi, the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi." And there's just some pictures here. River traffic, different river traffic photos. 1864 photo. Union gunboat fleet. This was at Cairo. Photo was taken at Cairo. And a lithograph that romanticizes life on the Mississippi River. Columbus, a town transformed. The view from these 180-foot bluffs has changed significantly in the last several centuries. The Mississippi River has shifted course. Portions of the bluff have crumbled into the river. The bustling town of Columbus, which once lay just beneath these bluffs, has largely vanished, and the view of Belmont across the river is not what it once was. Close your eyes, and even the sounds have changed. An element of quiet now exists in what was at the time a very noisy place. Well, it's not quiet right now because there's something, construction or something going on down by the river, but otherwise I think it'd be quiet here. Okay, this is a view from the bluffs looking toward the battlefield at Belmont in 1864. This is a map of Columbus and Belmont during the Civil War. And some of the details are not quite correct, it says. This is a photo of the members of the 4th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery on the bluffs in 1864. This is a bird's eye view of Columbus. It was taken approximately 1907. The original downtown area. It's gone now. And this is a plan of the Confederate fortifications at Columbus in 1862. And it was made by Union engineers. Gibraltar of the West. Troops under General Leonidas Polk fortified strategic line of bluffs here September 3rd, 1861, marking the CSA's first move in Kentucky. To prevent passage of Union gunboats, a huge chain was stretched across the Mississippi River. After Union success in Tennessee, the CSA evacuated on March 2nd, 1862. Union troops moved in the next day and held the position throughout the war. African Americans at Columbus during the Civil War. Confederate General Leonidas Polk occupied the site of Columbus and began erecting extensive fortifications in September of 1861. In addition to the soldiers under his command, more than 13,000 at one point, over 10,000 African American slaves were present. Several of those that were enslaved were personal servants of the officers, while all worked on building and maintaining earthen fortifications here at Columbus. And it talks about how they abandoned it. It's still, in March of 1862, it still remained a strategically important point. The Union Army came in, and there was a large garrison established here. Here's some loading some supplies. The slaves were loading them on the steamboat. There's escaped slaves were known as contrabands, and there's a photo of some. But Columbus, once the Union Army took over, like all Union posts in the slave states, it drew in large numbers of African Americans seeking freedom. Because of its location on the Mississippi River, many came as soon as the Union troops established themselves here. And Union policy was really kind of unclear of how to treat them. Some were known as contrabands. Some were returned to their masters, but then that became very unpopular in Congress, and they started sheltering them, which then proved unpopular with some of the more Southern political leaders in the Union. But the resources here at Columbus were overwhelmed. The resources in space, after Polk had abandoned this, 1,000 former slaves were settled here in an architectural colony. The colony was used throughout the war, and soon after, African Americans were allowed to enlist, and then it became the garrison by the 4th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. And it talks about the different activities that went on with these African Americans who were fighting for the Union or who were seeking safety with Union troops and the areas that they inhabited. And so here's the map of these Island Number 10 area. 4th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. This was the garrison that was established here by the Union Army after the Confederate Army had pulled out and Columbus was taken over. They had a lot of former slaves moving in. They established them as a garrison, and I'm not going to read all through this, but please feel free to pause and do so. Now, this entire regiment didn't serve in the same place at all times. They were moved around some, and they did accompany different colonels and generals, to different scenes of actions, of fights, and then they would come back. And they did serve at many towns along the Purchase region of Kentucky and Tennessee, guarded railroad bridges, key roads, and river ports. Very active, and they did a lot of very, very important duty for the Union Army along these areas where they were seeking freedom, and they helped with the fortifications after the Union took over as well. This one talks about the different earthquakes along the Mississippi. The 1811 and 1812 New Madrid earthquakes are here. It did, a lot happened especially with the New Madrid earthquake. It affected. Well, they talk about the Reelfoot Lake and that whole area, the rift there, and all of these sediment resettling. I'm not reading all of this. First of all, I don't understand a lot of it. But this talks about the different fault lines and the sunken crust of the Reelfoot Rift, and it's referred to as the New Mandarin Seismic Zone, which we're right here at Columbus, right on the river. So there's some accounts here from people who witnessed the different quakes. I know I'm moving quickly through these. There's just a lot of reading to do. Please feel free to pause and read these. Talking about the effects the quake had on the Mississippi River, that it disrupted the flow of the Mississippi River, and lots of banks, the cliffs, and things just fell into the rivers. Again, more first-hand accounts. What would happen today if this happened? It would cause extensive damage to the Mississippi River Valley in Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Southern Illinois, Western Kentucky, South Central Indiana, and St. Louis would also receive land and building damage. So basically it says that the ground would be liquefied, liquefaction of the ground surface, if this were to happen. Flow like jello. That is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Geologists aren't sure when this will happen, but they do say it will happen at some point. So, you know, I don't know. So that information is on the earthquakes. There's the bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. And this marker talks all about the Mississippi River in the Civil War. I'm not going to read every word, but I will scroll down through here so that you can catch the highlights. It talks about the goal being control of both armies. The Union and the Confederate armies wanted to control, of course, the Mississippi River. Kentucky, in the Civil War, did at first announce its neutrality because there were northern and southern sentiments in the state, and Kentuckians went and enlisted in both sides. This is the fortress here at Columbus. It shows the photos of all the landmines, the different forts, the rifle pits, all of these things. Then over here is that pontoon bridge, and it had the chain running through it. There were gunboats, federal gunboats on the Mississippi, Lexington and Tyler. These were some timber clads. There's information about them. And of course, why did the federal troops even attack here at Belmont? And it was the beginning of the campaign by Ulysses S. Grant, and basically it was to stop these movements of Kentucky in Confederate reinforcements into Missouri, and he decided to attack it at Belmont instead of a demonstration against Columbus, because he wanted a fight and his troops needed to fight to gain experience. And he took a risk attacking a camp located in an area overrun with Confederates. He believed the need justified the outcome. And Polk, we've learned, was not a very good general. He was a very religious and nice man. Was, you know, they called the bishop, and he just did not have any strategy beyond defense. There's really no offensive strategy going. It's about the battle at Belmont, Missouri, 7th of November, 1861. I'm not going to Read it all, of course, but I will scroll down through here so you can see it all. The first section here is the federal approach. So you can see on the big map, that's one. All right. Then they have the battle at the cornfield, which is here. And then the battle for the camp, which is number 3, which is here, is Camp Johnson. Talks about the federal gunboats. All right, number 4, Confederate reinforcements, which was here on the river. Number 5 was the federal retreat. Here. And number 6 is the battle at the landing. Which is way up here on this point of the river. So who won the battle at Belmont? They both claimed a victory. It was not a clear victory for either side. There was no military significance to the battle, but it was important for several reasons. Belmont was Grant's first major battle and marked the beginning of his Civil War career. And it also initiated the opening of the federal campaign to win the Mississippi River. The casualties in Grant's were wounded 306, captured or missing was 205, and there were 95 killed. And in Polk's troop, there were 419 wounded, 117 captured or missing, and 105 killed. And there were some prisoner and wounded exchanges, and then the Confederates withdrew from Columbus. And I'm going to show you the overall map here a little further out. In the middle, maybe you can see where all those numbers were that I was pointing to. This chain, very heavy chain, here at the state park outside Columbus, Kentucky, leads up to this very big, very heavy anchor. Let's see what this marker has to say about it. Anchor and chain. The rebels have a chain across the river about 1 mile above Columbus. It is sustained by flats at intervals, chain passing through steeples placed about the water's edge, the chain passing under the boats. Confederate General Leonidas Polk stretched this mile-long chain across the Mississippi River from Fort DeRussy on the Iron Banks Bluff north of Columbus to a capstan on the Belmont, Missouri shore. Polk hoped that any Union ships coming down the river would be stopped by the chain long enough for cannon fire to sink them. Most of the chain was removed after the Union occupation of Columbus in March 1862. The effort obviously failed. In December 1925, a landslide at the edge of the bluff exposed a section of the chain. Each link weighs 20 pounds, 5 ounces. Digging at the end of the chain revealed an anchor measuring 15 feet, 9.5 inches long, with flukes 9 feet from tip to tip. The anchor had been buried 11 feet deep with the flukes in a vertical position and fixed in place with 12-foot oak logs. It is estimated to weigh anywhere from 2 to 6 tons. There's pictures from the excavation after the landslide. And here's a better view of this anchor. This markers for the Confederate trenches. The main objective of the Confederate Army in fortifying Columbus was to block Union movements on the Mississippi River. In so doing, they also had to protect their position from inland attack. The trenches through which this trail leads are a part of an elaborate system of earthworks dug by Confederate soldiers. These trenches were heavily fortified with cannon and rifle batteries. You can kind of see, we're going to walk down through there and get some of those down there. All right. Polk's firepower. This model, 1829 cannon number 209, was affectionately called a 32-pounder. This simply means it shot a 32-pound round iron shot. Most of the large cannons used at Forts DeRussy, Henry, Donelson, Pillow, and Island number 10 were this size. Cast in 1839 at Fort Pitt Foundry in Pennsylvania, the cannon weighs nearly 4 tons and can fire a shot up to 1 1/2 miles. If you look at the lower breech, you can see the weight number 7545 stamped on the cannon. Confederate General Polk had at least 56 cannons of this type among his 140 cannon artillery standing watch over the mighty Mississippi here at Columbus. The Confederate Army obtained hundreds in 1861 when they seized the U.S. Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia. It is not known if 209 was one of the cannons left behind by Polk when he evacuated Columbus in 1862. The Union Army and Navy later shipped dozens of captured Confederate cannons here for temporary storage. This cannon and a Confederate 128-pounder were found here after the war ended. During the Great Flood of 1927, the other cannon fell into the Mississippi and was never recovered. In the 1930s, during the development of the Columbus-Belmont State Park, the Civilian Conservation Corps placed number 209 on a replica wooden carriage for exhibit. In 1943, a large strip of land along the bluff of the river collapsed, taking the cannon with it. Cannon number 209 would not be seen again for 55 years. In search of, apparently after cannon number 209 was lost, no effort was made to immediately recover the cannon. World War II created severe shortages of manpower, equipment, and money, and several searches after the war were unsuccessful. In 1984, a local historian and park volunteer, Mr. Eddie Roberts, began efforts to determine the location of the cannon by using maps and area surveys. In 1991, under Mr. Roberts' direction, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dug several sites at the base of the bluff, but failed to find the cannon. Roberts discovered the exact location of the cannon in 1998 by using a magnetometer. This instrument is used for comparing the intensity and direction of magnetic fields. Cannon 209 was buried at a depth of 42 feet. This was 20 feet deeper and about 8 feet south of where the 1991 search had ended. Approval was obtained from Kentucky State Parks and the Kentucky State Archaeological Office to recover the cannon. With the generous assistance and donations of local excavation and towing businesses, the cannon was successfully dug up and transported to the park. Without the volunteer efforts of the community, the project would not have been possible. Their help and encouragement is greatly appreciated. Now, number 209 has returned to stand its watch over the Mississippi River. All right, this is an aerial photo taken in 2013 from above of all of the different parts of the state park. And here's the 1862 Army map of rebel fortifications at Columbus, Kentucky, and it's overlaid on this image from 2013, so you can kind of see how where the trenches were and the fortifications that have been built. So that's kind of really cool. And I'm going to show you some of these areas. These are these trenches down through here and around that were built by the Confederate troops. This marker talks about the the generals involved of Columbus-Belmont. It's a really, the sign is in really bad shape, but it's talking about the fighting bishop, who was the Confederate States of America General Leonidas Polk, graduated from West Point, and personal friend of Jefferson Davis, a pious and kindly man loved by his soldiers, but he was basically an incompetent general. Polk had the added fault of hating to take orders. Yeah, that wouldn't be good. He broke Kentucky's neutrality in September 1861 by the occupation of the small Mississippi River port of Columbus. Polk made Columbus strong by leaving everywhere else weak. Defensively minded, he only waited to be attacked. After much weaker forts Henry and Donelson east of him fell, Polk and the Confederacy had to abandon Columbus. The Union General Ulysses S. Grant was the son of an Ohio tanner, a West Pointer, and a Mexican War veteran. He was the general who eventually became commander of all the armies of the United States. He was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. Fearless, offensively minded, Grant made mistakes. He learned from them and he pushed forward. The Battle of Belmont was Grant's first battle and the beginning of the Vicksburg Campaign. In 1869, Grant became the 18th President of the United States. This marker is for the Union Fort Hallack. Confederate Fort DeRussy was renamed Fort Hallack in honor of General Henry W. Hallack when Columbus became a Union Army and Navy supply depot. It was a major transportation center and a refuge for former slaves. Included in Fort Hallack's 1863 garrison was the Columbus-raised 2nd Tennessee Heavy Artillery Regiment, African descent, of former slaves. Sorry if I'm out of breath. I just walked up a long hill. The largest cannons inside were one 10-inch Columbiad, two 8-inch Columbiads, and one 42-pounder and 7 32-pounder siege cannons. Just like the former slaves, many of those cannons had once belonged to the Confederates. In April 1864, Private John A. Albright of the 16th Wisconsin Infantry drew a map of Fort Hallack. Shown inside were 9 small field cannons, 5 howitzers, and 9 large siege cannons. Also labeled were the headquarters building, the barracks and tents, a powder magazine, a guard room, a water tank, and even the latrine. The African American Regiment was briefly renamed the 3rd U.S. Heavy Artillery Regiment, colored, before becoming the 4th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment. There's that map. The Confederate Fort DeRussy. Fort DeRussy on the Iron Banks Bluff was the largest of the 5 earthwork forts built by the Confederates, named for General Leonidas Polk's chief military engineer, Colonel Lewis G. DeRussy. This fort was protected on the land side by a 29-foot wide and 8-foot deep semicircular zigzag trench, and on the water side by a 180-foot drop down to the Mississippi River. This fort mounted 27 large siege cannons. On each of the 5 highest points inside was a powerful cannon protected by a crescent-shaped sandbag position. One was the famous Lady Polk 6.4-inch rifled Columbiad. Also within this fort was a powder magazine, a water tank, and the tents and small wooden shelters of the garrison. Below this fort, 3 shelves dug into the side of the bluff held 25 more cannons. There's a drawing. You can kind of see the earthen mounds that they built throughout this section as trenches and fortifications. This marker talks about some of this. The defenses of the Confederate Columbus. A mile-long chain guarded by river mines stretched across the Mississippi River from a large anchor buried inside Fort DeRussy to Belmont, Missouri. Union ships that survived the river mines and long-range rifle cannon on the Iron Banks Bluff would be stopped by the chain barrier and finished off by powerful short-range smoothbore cannon placed along the river's bank. Columbus-Belmont State Park contains 3 of the 5 earthwork forts and about 10% of the miles of trenches that once surrounded Columbus. The earthworks protected 17,000 soldiers and 140 cannons. Electrically fired landmines lined the roads leading into town. The North thought using torpedoes, land and river mines was unfair and cowardly. They condemned them as infernal machines. To the south, these were simply a good defense against powerful invaders. CSA Navy Lieutenant Isaac N. Brown, later captain of the famous ironclad Arkansas, was in charge of the torpedoes at Columbus. The Confederate Navy at Columbus had 6 wooden gunboats, the floating artillery battery New Orleans with 20 cannon, and the ironclad ram Manassas. The Confederates proudly called Columbus the Gibraltar of the West. And there's a picture that shows the chain and how they're all the mines and everything going on there. Continuing our walk here, look at Columbia-Belmont State Park. We have reached this point, which is marked by a marker that says Arrowhead Point. This point overlooks a portion of the cannon and rifle trenches which surrounded Columbus. These trenches were planned and fortified in expectation of a land attack by General Grant from Paducah. Grant, learning the strength of this fortification, made no attempt to attack by land. And see, I don't know what we can see up here. But I guess this trench work just continues on around, and then it's actually quite amazing, but was never utilized because Grant did not come in this way. This marker says Redoubt. A redoubt is a fort or fort system consisting of an enclosed defensive emplacement outside a larger fort, usually relying on earthworks. It is meant to protect soldiers outside the main defensive line and can be a permanent structure or a temporary fortification. This earthen redoubt can be seen on this map of the Confederate fortifications drawn by U.S. Army engineers later in the war. And you can see that here and here. See that or not. Sorry, make that clear. This is where the redoubt sign is. It's a fragment of a 6.4 inch of a gradual release gun. I guess was located here during some surveying that was done. Well, what'd y'all think of Hickman County, Kentucky? Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Lots of loud trucks. So thank you for joining us for this episode. If you haven't done so yet, like and follow and share and all of those good things that we need done to get the message out there, and find some other people who enjoy learning about the history of their area. And if we missed something or you think there's someplace we need to go, let us know. We'll catch you on the next episode.